Happy summer, Connecting Point. I hope you're all staying cool this week. This week we're going to be jumping into a new series through the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and we probably won't be finishing it until sometime in 2023 because we're going to be jumping in and out of a couple of other studies as well. I think we're planning to do Mark come the new year, but as I was starting to research Samuel, I discovered that these books are broken into two in our modern Bibles. That didn't take much research. That took opening to the table of contents in my Bible. But originally they were actually thought of as one large scroll. But then for the sake of the copyists and storage of scrolls and codices and other things like that, they actually were chopped into two. At Saul's death is kind of where it happens. And so it's one continuous narrative, but it is broken into two sections in our Bible. What we're going to end up doing is actually going to break it into three parts for the sake of getting in and out of Old Testament and New Testament, and we have some other stuff coming up. Of course, Christmas is coming up towards the end of the year, so we'll be doing that going forward, and that's what we're going to be talking about today is kind of taking this it might be a 30,000 foot view of the book of Samuel. The story that you find in Samuel is the story of the transition of Israel from the time of the judges to what it becomes during the reign of their greatest king, David, and then the kingdom that he bequeaths to his son, Solomon. And that those two reigns, it's an 80-year period, those kind of constitute the golden age of ancient Hebrew culture. The wealth, influence, cultural influence, political influence, moral high ground as well too. Like it's the time when they're, I don't know, I guess as the kingdom of Israel, they're most following God's laws. So I want to start by recapping where we left Israel at the end of our series in Judges, which we completed last year. And we're going to do this in a very teachery way because, if the shoe fits. So I'm going to ask you to try to recall where we leave Israel at the end of the book of Judges. Here's your table talk. What is Israel like at the end of the book of Judges? Now, hopefully you came up with a few different pieces of info that you recalled about it. One of the ones that I really want to make sure that you remember is that ominous phrase we get at the end of the book of Judges, and each man did what was right in his own eyes, which explains the moral and spiritual state of the nation of Israel at the end of the book of Judges. And I want you to think about what a far cry that is from where we leave them off in the previous two books. Deuteronomy ends with Israel reaffirming its commitment to God through this series of speeches that Moses makes, and then he gives them this charge: choose life and live, follow the ways of the Lord, follow these laws that we've given you. And then at the end of the book of Joshua, they've completed their conquest. They haven't completely completed it, but they have control of the land. And Joshua gives them this charge to follow the ways of the Lord, and that he and his house are going to be doing that, and they kind of are free now to choose life and live. And then the book of Judges is about watching the whole nation, tribe by tribe, and kind of in a cyclical way, watching them just fail to do so. And we end up at the end of the book of Judges with each one does what is right in their own eyes. Kind of sad. And you may recall even that particularly disturbing story that we get at the end of the book of Judges, 19, 20, 21, where it's one of the most violent chapters in the entire Bible, which is quite a feat to think about that. But it ends with Israel not even under the thumb of a foreign nation. They're actually devolving into civil war and oppressing each other now, as the tribe of Benjamin kind of runs afoul of the other tribes, and then there's this tremendous massacre. First, the Benjamites are able to ambush the other 11 tribes who show up. Well, it's not all 11, but the group who does show up, and they kill a whole bunch of the warriors of the rest of the Hebrews, and then the other guys come up with a plan to defeat the Benjamites, and it just turns into this awful thing. When the fighting is over, Benjamin is almost destroyed. Like, they are almost dead. And the other tribes kind of regret all the killing, and they don't really have a way to save face and help the Benjamites to repopulate. So they come up with this wacky scheme, and it just is like this. It's just this pathetic display of immoral choice after immoral choice, and watching the Israelites just killing each other. It's a kind of a strange thing to think about, that Moses leaves Israel unified with a purpose and in good shape, and then he dies at the end of Deuteronomy. Joshua has helped Israel to achieve that purpose, and he gives them the charge, and he dies. By the end of Judges, they're not doing their purpose, and Benjamin almost dies, right? And that's kind of a strange thought. However, one of the things that we did learn in our Judges study is that the time of Judges isn't only about the bleakness. Tracy took us through the story of Ruth, and there are two things of significance in that book that have bearing on our story that we're going to be doing through Samuel. So Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges, and the majority of the story takes place in Bethlehem, which is just south of Jerusalem. And the default position that is held by all of the characters in the story of Ruth is that Yahweh is Lord, and that we should be following his laws. Boaz, who is Ruth's eventual husband in the story, is a righteous man, to be sure, but he's not like an exceptionally righteous man. He's doing what he's supposed to do. And the whole story has this expectation that God's laws are going to be followed. You might recall from the end of Ruth that she, the Moabitess, who becomes this faithful Jew through the faithfulness of her mother-in-law, Naomi, and then her husband Boaz, really all glory to Yahweh in the process, eventually becomes the great-grandmother of the main character of our Samuel narrative, David, who ends up becoming both the gold standard for what the Hebrew kingship should be, and also the great-grandsire, as it were, of Jesus himself. And the key part of that lineage. So even though we have bleakness and moral decay and whatnot, we actually do have pockets of a remnant, as it were, of faithful Israelites who are going to be called out and are acting the part of the people that God has called them out to be, right? Acting the part of the people of God. Now, our study through Samuel is going to touch on these narrative points, and I'll quickly lay out kind of the plan for the whole series right now. Up until the Christmas season this year, we're going to go through 1 Samuel until about chapter 20, which will introduce us to all the major characters in the story and take us through the rise of Israel's first king, Saul, and then conclude with Saul chasing David out of his court. We'll likely pick up David's story after Easter 2022, and then we'll track it through until he recaptures Jerusalem. Then we'll take another break and then pick up the final part of the story, which will be David as the king and watching him age and then die. In thinking about this kind of grand story that we're following for the next couple of years, I wanted to talk a little bit about some issues that come up when reading Old Testament narrative. And I want to refer you to a video that Doug and I did at the beginning of our Judges series that talks about some of the key points of studying Old Testament narratives. But one of the ones that I wanted to bring back to your attention was that Doug points out that in all of the Bible, Jesus is the main character. And whenever you're reading a narrative in the Bible, you have to keep in mind that Jesus is actually sort of the main character. Now, that might seem a little strange when you're reading these other stories about other people, but the reason that we say that kind of a thing is because Jesus himself identifies as that. If you think about what it is to claim to be the Son of Man or to make these messianic claims, Jesus is kind of claiming to be the point of the whole thing. And Paul and John both write to explain as much, Peter as well. The New Testament understands Jesus as the main character of the Bible. Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart wrote a book that's kind of the classic text on how to read the Bible for with a literary genres in your perspective. And they talk about narrative. It's called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, and it's worth picking up if you can find a copy of it. So they talk about the 3 layers of any narrative text that you're going to see in the Bible, and the top layer is they call it the meta-narrative, but that's this story of God, and it means that God is always going to be kind of the main character. That's what the Bible's really trying to convey, is what about God, right? The second layer is going to be God's means of expressing himself in the world, I guess would be a way to put it. And it's the story of God redeeming a people for his name's sake. And then the third layer is going to be those individual stories that are going to have the individual characters. Like in our story that we're going to start next week, Hannah and Eli are going to be kind of the 2 main characters in our individual story. But even though they're the characters who are going to say most of the words, the main character for the whole story is always God. That top layer is the one that makes Jesus so central to the Bible, because if he is in fact who he claims to be, he's the main deal, right? So in the Bible then, all stories have a protagonist. And, I mean, that's not just in the Bible, that's in all stories. They always have a protagonist. But in the Bible, that protagonist is always going to be God himself, which makes our antagonist not any of the people of the Bible, but actually the power that opposes God, which is the power of evil, or the Satan, or the devil, or however you want to term that power. So, if God is our protagonist, and the Satan is our antagonist, as we read the entirety of the Bible, where does this leave all these different characters that we're going to interact with through our series? Well, Fee and Stewart give us a third category of character that's neither exclusively pro or exclusively anti. And they call them agonists, which is a bit of a funny word, but agon is this Greek word that's used for a struggle or a contest, like an athletic contest or something like that. We get our word agonize from this same word, or agony, which is, it kind of has a different meaning in English now, but it just means struggling or contesting with something. And I kind of like this idea of describing the human characters in the Bible, aside from Jesus, as agonists who struggle, with God and also with themselves, of course, right? I especially think this is helpful when looking at Old Testament narratives, because we do tend to fall into a trap of reading for, the human character to be the protagonist who overcomes things, fairy tale kind of style, or Aesop fable kind of style. Or we read for the moral of the story, and we want to see the human heroes that we can emulate or be like or revere or something like that. But the truth is, in the scriptures, nobody is worthy of that except for Jesus. Not even the greatest of Israelites, like Moses or David, or Peter or Paul for that matter, right? It's also an important thing to remember as we read through a book like Samuel, and this was true in our study through Judges as well, that we actually don't get a lot of comment from the editor of the book on whether what we're reading is good or bad. The Old Testament narrative writers assume that you understand the law and that you understand the wisdom of following God's ways, and that you can and will use your own judgment and discernment to try to understand the story for yourself. So, this gives me a chance to give you another table talk question. Does this idea of human characters as agonists in the Bible, neither exclusively good nor exclusively bad, help you to understand the stories better? Does it help you to understand yourself better? Keeping that meta-narrative level, God the protagonist, Satan the antagonist, in mind as you read the Bible is a really important thing to do. But the second layer is one that I also want to emphasize today, and that's this idea of the chosen method of God's action in the world as protagonist is to call people to him and to include humans in his redemption work. There's been a bit of a move lately, and I think especially during the pandemic, to kind of hyper-individualize one's Christian walk, right? You can find good teaching online. You can, listen to worship songs and find worship sets to participate in, and you don't have to go and talk to people in the room. Maybe I can just do that on my own, can't I? Well, no, not really, right? The point of God's plan throughout history has been to include people, but not just as individuals, but to incorporate them into a people. This kind of a little trite way to think of it is that God's plan for redemption from the beginning has been to make a faithful people for himself, not faithful persons. And it doesn't mean that you lose your individuality, but it does mean that you become part of this body, right? And there's reasons why they use those kinds of metaphors throughout the New Testament. And this isn't to say that we're all going to look alike or think alike or act alike, but it is an important part of being part of God's chosen people, is that it is you do bring your individuality to the equation, but as part of a community, and you hold those two things together in tension. And this issue of God making a people for himself is going to end up becoming central to the story that we're going to read on that third layer, those individual instances in the Samuel sequence as well. So to finish up today, I want to give you a couple of the particular themes to look for as we start into these stories next week. So the first one that I want to give you is to keep your eye out for the structure of the story. I'm going to be using this translation and commentary by a Jewish Old Testament scholar named Robert Alter quite a bit. And in Alter's intro to his Samuel translation, he describes how Samuel, if it weren't a history, it would read like the greatest novel of the ancient world, because the narrative is so smartly crafted, and there's so much art in the way that it is structured, both in the individual sequences, but also in the kind of the larger sequence of the whole story. The characters are so human. The themes of tragedy and heroism are both epic but relatable, and then the structure of the story itself just lends itself to study and to contemplation and all of that. One example that he gives of this is in 1 Samuel chapter 2, you find a poem, a song, that is recited by Hannah, who is Samuel's mother. And it sets the themes and the ideas out for the entire narrative that we're about to read, particularly about elevating the humble and the downtrodden and bringing down the proud. You'll see how that'll play out kind of regularly as we come through the Samuel sequence. But near the end of the story, in 2 Samuel 22 and a little bit into 23, David also has poems, songs of his own, which mirror those of Hannah's to create this wonderful Hebrew symmetry that you can look for throughout the Old Testament scriptures. And we're actually going to see this kind of structuring come up a few times, and I expect we're going to end up with some more poetry kind of dabbled in throughout the series, because 73 of the 150 Psalms in your Old Testament are attributed to David. And I found this an interesting thing to think about, because Alter also points out in his intro that in the Samuel narrative, Saul is a remarkably open book in terms of what is going on in his heart and his mind. You kind of get a lot of Saul's inner turmoil, whereas David is quite opaque as you read through 1 and 2 Samuel. David's actions are pretty driven by his political ambition and motives. And Alter points out that you might not even find David being, I don't know if you want to call it authentic or just speaking without any sort of political motive, until almost chapter 12 of 2 Samuel. So we've already spent nearly 30 chapters with him at this point, and he's finally been not merely a political animal. And this is during the loss of his infant son that he had with Bathsheba after his adulterous affair with her. And so I think that's a very interesting thing, that as you do this kind of critical read through of the book of Samuel, that David is this kind of just this cynical political person a lot of the time. But I think one of the reasons why we get this story of David as political animal, as statesman, rather than as just a man, is because we get such a lot of insight into him as a man and his motivations through his poetry, through his psalms. And so the Bible gives us kind of this twin picture of who David is. And it actually is one of the things that God himself will point out to David as David starts to want to build a temple, is that David is not just a man of poems and worship and the things that we do associate with him, and rightly so, but he's also a man of violence. And we're going to have to hold those two things in tension as we kind of go through. And frankly, he's kind of the man that Israel needs to transition from the uber violence of the Judges age into the kind of the more golden age that David and then Solomon get to preside over. So this idea of structuring and of literary style is one of the things that I want you to keep your eyes out for. But the other theme that I want you to keep your eyes out for is how the author really loves to use characters in pairs throughout the narrative. The big one for the whole sequence is Saul, who is going to show up as a failed king ultimately, and David, who, despite some personal failings, is going to be the standard for success for a king throughout the rest of the Old Testament narratives. And they're the big ones that we're going to see juxtaposed against each other. That use of characters as foils, so just where they're not necessarily that they're opposing each other, but that they're doing different things, and so that they're kind of different emphases are being placed by the different characters. It's going to come up throughout the whole thing. And we're going to actually see that beginning next week in our first chapter. Hannah is going to be contrasted with Eli, the priest that she goes and talks to. Hannah is also going to be contrasted with her sister wife, because she's married to a man who has two wives, and weird, but that's okay. We'll talk about that more next week. And you're going to just see that throughout the whole thing, right? We're going to see Samuel bounce off other characters, Eli, Saul. We're going to see Saul bounce off characters. We're going to see David bounce off Jonathan, off Joab. There's just this litany of really interesting, deep, round characters that you're going to get to see act as foils for each other. Okay, so I'm going to land the plane this week by summarizing the story that we're going to see through the first leg of our journey. So that's going to be the first 20-ish chapters. We're going to be starting out seeing the priest, Eli, be supplanted, usurped, as it were, by a young boy, Samuel, who acts as prophet, and then as he grows up as judge as well. And Samuel's kind of the final judge of the Judges sequence. But the people ultimately reject Samuel's leadership and demand a king to unite them. Now recall that the kingly line is supposed to go through Judah. This is a prophecy made by Jacob upon his deathbed. But God, in his wisdom, doesn't lead Samuel to a Judahite at first. He begins by leading Samuel to a Benjamite named Saul. Now recall what we said about the end of the book of Judges, that Benjamin, within a couple generations of Saul being approached to be king, has been nearly wiped out by the rest of the 11 tribes of Israel in this horrible civil war kind of situation. And so God, even by leading Samuel to the wrong man, as it were, is doing this interesting work of redeeming Benjamin into the national life of the nation. And he brings them back into the fold, as it were. And Saul really looks the part, and people do unite around him and beneath him, right? And Saul is able to have quite a few successes at first. However, we'll see that Saul begins to suffer from his pride and from having this issue of wanting other people to see that he's doing a good job. And so Samuel will have to appoint a successor who will be the true successor, the rightful successor, as it were, from the prophetic perspective, from the line of Judah, and that's going to be David, who comes from the town of Bethlehem. David begins his public life by slaying a Philistine champion in full view of the entire army. Extremely public move, and an extremely legend-making kind of a sequence for him. And so David ends up moving into Saul's court. He becomes a general. He wins a bunch of battles. He grows in popularity. He's also a brilliant musician, and so we have this whole kind of world of courtly life that we're inducted into, but then Saul's jealousy takes complete hold of him. He tries to kill David, and David has to flee out into the wilderness. And so that's where we're going to end up putting the pin in the story, is with Saul kind of in the throes of decay, in madness, with David on the run in the wilderness, and with kind of this further question of how is Israel going to be extracted from further tragedy here. So that's a bit of a technical talk that we've kind of done this week, but I want to point out somewhere that you might be able to make a bit of application for yourself as we close, and that's thinking through this redemption story for the tribe of Benjamin. Here's going to be the kind of the table talk question. Do you know anyone who is on the outs with God, or with the people of God, who needs to see God's mercy, and that they need to see that God wants to draw them to himself? Maybe they're in a place like the Benjamites were, just like decimated and feeling just out of the loop. And I think it's so neat that God brings Benjamin back in by grabbing a man from them to be the first king of Israel. Pray for someone who's in that state, in that broken place, and needs to be reinstated or needs to be given hope. And we'll see you next week to start 1 Samuel chapter 1.